The Wind is an independent show made possible by listener support. If you'd like to help keep this thing existing in the world, head to patreon.com/thewind and set up a monthly donation. You'll get access to bonus episodes, patches, shirts, and all types of cool benefits, and you'll become a crucial part of this community. That's patreon.com/thewind. We're currently airing a series by the name of Devil Music, and this episode is called The Santanic Panic.
The Wind. With Phil Corbett.
It entered the room through the speakers. A presence not seen, but felt, not heard, but understood. A feeling deep in my chest, a guess, shoulders, arms, fingers, a presence I knew well. Others had a name for it, but I did not. They didn't know it like I did. It was like an idea that my body had. The thought that the whole thing wasn't as they said. When I stood, I could still feel the vibration in the floorboards, the knob turning, till it stopped. Can you introduce yourself and say where you're based?
Sure. Hi, my name is Aja Romano. I'm a culture writer for Vox, and I'm in Brooklyn.
How do you define the Santanic Panic?
I view the Santanic Panic as two different things that are connected. The Santanic Panic refers to a specific era during the 1980s and 1990s, and this led to a number of people being, and a number of institutions being unfairly criminalized and persecuted because they were believed to be spreading Satanism, basically. So there's that. But then Satanic Panic as a belief system also refers to the ongoing use of the idea of Satanism and hysteria around Satanism and satanic ritual abuse to continue to spread new moral panics today.
That article you wrote for Vox about the Satanic Panic, specifically in the 80s into the 90s, you wrote that kind of the rise in public interest about Satanism and the occult kind of happened just a little bit before that in the 70s. Like what were kind of some of the roots of this fascination that seemed to take hold?
So I think you had kind of two different trajectories converging. And so you had in the late 60s and early 70s, you had a lot of like really psychosexual material entering the public consciousness. And you had things like the Manson murders really kind of putting the idea of killer ritual cults on the map, right? You had the rise, obviously, of the counterculture, and there was a moral panic surrounding that, you know, like now you have these drug crazed hippies ruining everything. And at the same time, we saw kind of this counter interest in really like fundamentalist religion rising. And so you had all of this kind of bubbling through the 70s. Specifically, you had these memoirs. So in 1972, you had this memoir that was entirely false called Satan Cellar. That's kind of an example of one of those guys who claimed to have found God after undergoing an incredibly traumatic childhood in which he was sort of forcibly inducted into this satanic cult, where he sort of rose through the ranks to, you know, murder children and perform all kinds of unspeakable, sexual acts. And then he became the high satanic priest.
Yeah.
And it was completely made up, but it was a bestseller. People ate it up. And it sort of gave rise to a number of like other copycat types of writings. And this sort of continued throughout the 70s and into the 80s. That was sort of the zeitgeist at the time.
One of the flashpoints that you mentioned, too, is that book called Michelle Remembers, which sort of taps into some of that as well. Can you describe what that was and kind of its impact on this whole movement?
Yeah, Michelle Remembers was published in 1980, so it's sort of like the beginning of the actual Satanic Panic, I would say. The difference between Michelle Remembers and everything that came before it is that it had the stamp of quote-unquote authority because it was co-written by a guy who was, at the time, an acclaimed psychologist. He was also faking it. Like, everything he did was bad, to put it mildly. Because, like, for one thing, Michelle, the titular Michelle was his wife, who was his former patient. And so the psychologist essentially kind of coaxed her into, quote unquote, recovering, quote unquote, repressed childhood memories. Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff that's many psychological methods that have since been discredited, right? But then you take that and you combine it with this idea that the memories that she, quote unquote, recovered were all about her being part of a satanic cult and undergoing what became known as satanic ritual abuse. And then Lawrence Pasdar, the psychologist, helped her publish this memoir called Michelle Remembers. And it became a bestseller. And it sort of really mainstreamed this idea that satanic cults were real, satanic cults abusing children were real, and that they were doing so during these like high satanic rites. So it codified essentially a lot of the ingredients, kind of a template for how people would then begin to accuse others of enacting satanic ritual abuse. When I say it was a template, it actually was used as a textbook for law enforcement agencies during the 80s and early 90s. So it was a big deal. Like, you had not only law enforcement, but other child psychologists and other authorities, teachers. It was presented to people as, this is a guide for how you can recognize if someone has undergone satanic ritual abuse.
Yeah.
But again, all of this was completely false. The memoir was completely false. Michelle Smith was never in a satanic cult. But the horse was out of the barn by the time people, really realized that.
How did this phenomenon play out? Like, how did it play out in real life?
To a degree, you can say that it's still playing out. And this is where you make the distinction between like the actual period that people think of as the era of Satanic Panic and the pattern that it set in motion of people, having their suspicions raised and then going at half-cocked, as it were, and making accusations against other people and having those accusations land. When I say having those accusations land, I mean having them be found to be credible within the court system. So what you had beginning around 1980, the same year that the book was published, was that people who read Michelle Remembers started to accuse locals in their area of being parts of these satanic cults. The first example were social workers in Bakersfield, California, accusing people who were, I think, childcare daycares to being part of a clandestine occult sex ring. And so you had law enforcement investigating these claims. So you had the Bakersfield accusations that led to a full-blown police investigation. And those actually resulted in 26 people, at least, being sent to jail.
Actually, in this case, it was 36 people.
That's just one example of many. There are many, many people who actually spent decades in prison because of this. And most of those sentences were eventually overturned, and most of those people were eventually exonerated, but not all of them were. Some of them died in prison. Some of them were only exonerated after they died. And I think at least one of them was still in prison as of a year ago. So, I mean, it's really kind of hard to quantify the human toll of all of this.
In many of these cases, analysts, police, and psychiatrists who were often not trained in questioning children were brought in to interrogate young kids, and in doing so, would ask leading questions. So, though children should be listened to, of course, especially when raising concerns about the actions of authority figures, it seems quite clear in retrospect that these kids were encouraged to confirm what the interrogators already believed. The children in one case told pretty fantastical tales about rituals and blood. One said that the teacher in question was able to fly. To some, this detail was proof of supernatural satanic forces, but to others, it seemed to confirm that the kids were being encouraged to tell creative stories.
I think another really good example is the San Antonio Four, who were a group of lesbian women. And this didn't happen until 1997, which is very, very late in the era of Satanic Panic. But essentially the same thing happened. We saw these women being tied to accusations of child molestation on absolutely no basis. But because they were all gay, essentially local prejudice played out against them. And they were convicted on no evidence, and they spent 15 years in prison. And they were, again, they had their convictions ultimately overturned. But again, it took 15 years.
That's something I did want to talk about as well is, how allegations of Satanism and of occultism is often tied in a lot of these cases specifically to queer people. They're just tied together in this specific kind of flashpoint.
Yeah, I think something that queer people know really, really well, but often gets overlooked if you're, a member of a fairly stable majority community, right? It's really easy to overlook a lot of things that are really obvious to other communities, right? So, if you're, for example, a queer person, you kind of learn to embrace villainy as part of your identity, because what other choice do you have in a society that is constantly trying to turn you into a villain, right? So if you're a villain, if you see yourself as a villain and you you're going to be villainized anyway, right? Then you embrace villainy, you embrace deviance, you perform. I mean, look at the meme, be gay, do crimes, right? You perform exuberant deviance as part of your identity. And that ironically then gives the people who want to persecute you more fodder to persecute you when the time comes, which is how we get to this idea of gay people, gay men are always pedophiles, or gay men are always linked to sexual predation, and all of these other stereotypes that are emphatically not true, but they're still used today to demonize and marginalize queer people in communities. One of the pieces that I wrote this year it was a roundtable that I did with my colleagues, Alyssa Wilkinson and Emily Vanderwerf, who like me are all from rural areas. And we all grew up reading this famed Christian fantasy author, Frank Peretti. And we did this roundtable on Frank Peretti novels of the 80s and why they were so influential, because he wrote this book called This Present Darkness. It was a major bestseller, and it was a kind of a Christian fiction genre, game changer, because it sort of paved the way for this era of Christian fantasies, including the Left Behind series. And this book, This Present Darkness, it basically posits that there's this preacher in this town who realizes that he's facing a vast left-wing liberal conspiracy that is being essentially propped up in the shadows by a bunch of demons. And the way that it presents the fight between good and evil is that the heroic Christians in the book will essentially be faced with liberals who are saying really nice things about love and kindness, and they want you to do yoga, but behind them, literally physically behind them, there's a giant hulking demon, and there's a demon on their shoulder, because it's all a ploy to suck you into the grasp of Satan. And this is a really, really heady idea. And this book sold millions of copies. I read it when I was 12, and it fucked me up for a whole year. When I was in 6th grade, it just really took hold of me. And I saw demons everywhere. I was oh, is there a demon behind that person? Is there a demon behind that person? And I was 12. That's how you think when you're 12, because these books they had such a hold on you, right? But this is really how this panic spreads. It's because, even the most innocuous anodyne well-intentioned thing that like someone who is just trying to be a good person can say can become swept up in this idea that it's all part of this more noxious, larger agenda. And that's sort of the root, that's sort of the core of what Satanic Panic is, you know, this idea that everything that they do is suspicious.
You know, these conspiracies, like you said, are basically claiming there are like Satanist daycare workers. There's like this shadowy cabal of underground Satan worshipers that exists in your everyday life, in your peaceful suburb. But what it seems to be in this really weird twist is like it's this bizarro made up reflection world of what was like actually happening in a lot of the evangelical and Catholic churches in these places. Like in the Catholic Church, this stuff was actually happening. Sexual abuse was happening in these places, and it wasn't being done by a shadowy cabal of Satanists. You know, it was being done by like prominent community figures.
Right. And, you know, we learned this year that the Southern Baptist Convention actually had a spreadsheet for years that it compiled of sexual predators who were in the church, who were in the Southern Baptist Convention as leaders. And apparently just they had that spreadsheet and it was there and nobody did anything. So like, yeah. So like to some degree, a lot of this is just like systemic, right? Like in any system where power is gained by playing the game and then maintaining the game, right? You're going to have people who benefit from that system because other people are incentivized to be silent, right? And not rock the boat. And that's exactly how you wind up with the example of the Catholic Church, you know, decades of people being able to prey on victims and have no consequences because they just keep getting moved around because that's the system. And I think when you do try and speak out against a system like that, you know, you become the target of slander and you become the target of having rumors spread about you. So like, what's the quickest way to shut down any conversation about pedophilia in the church? Well, it's to make the real problem all the people out there who are trying to bring the church down. It's to deflect. And a really, really good way to deflect is to spread hysteria about whatever enemy you happen to be using as your deflection point on that particular day. There's a ready list of groups who get that targeting at any given moment.
A lot of the Satanic Panic did kind of focus on heavy metal music and punk music. I think punk and especially metal and heavy metal, like they were playing with these really interesting narrative lines around power and kind of like ways to claim power and perform power in a way that gave, you know, often disaffected young white kids from, you know, suburban America a way to kind of, you know, reclaim some of the power that they felt that they had been stripped of or promised and never got. And so I'm wondering, you know, how you see power playing out.
When you think about music in the 80s and like where we were in the 80s, you know, you had the rise of suburbia, especially during the era of Reaganomics, right? Like suburbia was supposed to represent the ideal of the American capitalist dream, right? And it was supposed to represent like traditional American values, right? Like you're supposed to have your white picket fence and your 2.5 kids. And it was supposed to be this like garden of safety and traditionalism and law-abiding people who knew what the rules were. And so when you think about heavy metal music in the context of that, heavy metal music just kind of blows everything up, and punk rock too. Like anytime you have kids who are coming from these like supposedly staid middle class backgrounds talking about their disaffectedness and singing about blowing shit up and, you know, singing about wanting to, you know, take wrecking balls to the power structure, like it's got to be really disturbing to the people who want to preserve that power structure, right? And so heavy metal music itself becomes a really, really easy target, especially because part of the, you know, obviously punk rock and metal too are both subcultures which are about aesthetics. as much as they are about the music itself, right? Like they're about performing your nonconformity, essentially. And so to that extent, they have a lot in common with queer culture, which is also very much about performing your nonconformity and embracing your deviance, right? Obviously in punk, you have very specific types of hairstyles and dress and codes that show your commitment to the subculture. The same with metal, the same with goth. You know, you have these lifestyles that are about making the music a part of this larger statement of identity and individuality, which conflicts directly with the kind of America that we were supposed to have in the 80s, within this very prosperous era of yuppies moving to the suburbs.
In the book Teenage Wasteland, author Donna Gaines follows a group of burnouts in suburban New Jersey, watching as their adolescence becomes adulthood, drinking and smoking weed in parking lots and abandoned industrial sites. Called to the town by a highly publicized and tragic suicide pact between 4 young rock fans in 1987, Gaines watches through the following years as relationships and reputations grow and shift in a friend group adjacent to the tragedy. She tries to understand what kids like this were actually going through in this place. In one illuminating passage, she writes, "For kids growing up now, in a town like mine, the dreams of prior generations are lost. The suburban frontier no longer exists. There is no sure place to move to find a better life. Land is increasingly unavailable, unaffordable, or unusable. Home ownership is becoming unimaginable." This was published in 1990, by the way. "The trend of remaining at home into adulthood drags on, making the dream of independent living seem impossible. You feel stuck in your hometown forever, like it or not. The world out there is shrinking. The possibilities of suburbia are exhausted, and your capacity to dream has reached a dead end."
For their kids to be this upset, something had to have gotten a hold of them, and if it wasn't drugs, then what was it? It must be Satan,
Yeah, and it's so interesting because what got a hold of them is the hollowness or the broken promises of the parents themselves or of the society themselves.
If you listen to the lyrics of these songs, that's exactly what they're saying. There's a real refusal to be self-reflective, and to examine, the underlying causes that might be creating whatever disaffectedness you're witnessing, and instead the impulse is to go, oh, this must be due to some XYZ larger, almost supernatural force.
Aja defines the Satanic Panic as 2 separate but connected things. First, a specific era in the 80s and 90s, where moral hysteria spread and court cases about satanic ritual abuse led to the very real imprisonment of innocent people. Second, the Satanic Panic is a mode of thought, a moral panic whose framework continues to exist and sway legislation and public opinion to this day. And one of the eternal battlefields of moral panics is, and always has been, music. In contemporary culture, we see this playing out with artists like Lil Nas X being lambasted on right-wing cable television. His music video for Montero, Call Me By Your Name, features him riding a stripper pole to hell and giving a cartoonish representation of the devil a lap dance. It's a funny and interesting use of imagery, but to hear the talking head say it, it's just the newest example in a long line of musicians peddling satanic sexuality with a nefarious agenda.
It's probably not a coincidence that the greatest blues musician of all time, Robert Johnson, was also considered to have sold his soul to the devil, right? Because what kind of music is blues? It's all about lamenting your oppression, lamenting poverty, lamenting your disenfranchised state as a Black person in the South. when you look at people like Lil Nas X, who he's been so brilliantly parodying a lot of that mentality, right? That gives him a certain power, because obviously being queer, a lot of that queer culture is about reclaiming power and turning symbols and codes that have been used to marginalize you and oppress you and be bigoted towards you, turning those symbols into reclamations of power and control and joy and exuberance. What better way to do that than through music?
The Wind is produced by me, Phil Corbett. This podcast is made possible by listener support. If you'd like to become a patron, head to patreon.com/thewind and set up a monthly donation. Thanks to Aja Romano for speaking with me for this episode. I'll post links to their work at thewind.org. And if you'd like to leave a review on Apple or follow the show on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube, all those links are also on the website at thewind.org. Thank you for being here, and keep listening.